friends, Alisa Childers here. Did you know that the New Testament Gospels weren't the only Gospels that were written about Jesus' life? How do we know that the Gospels that are in our Bibles tell the truth about his life and teachings? Is there anything we can learn from these extra-biblical or non-canonical Gospels? We're going to talk about it with a special guest on today's podcast. Today's guest is a cold case homicide detective, popular national speaker, and best-selling author J. Warner Wallace. He was a conscientious and vocal atheist until he was 35 when he investigated the claims of Christianity in very much the same way he investigated his cold cases. The conclusion he came to is that Christianity is actually true, and ever since, he has continued to take an evidential approach to the truth as he examines the Christian worldview. So he's done some great investigative work on the subject we're going to talk about today, which is what some people would call the lost Gospels or the non-canonical Gospels. So he's going to help us make some sense out of these writings, what they are, and how we as Christians can be knowledgeable and wise in the way that we interact with them. So Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back. This is one of those topics that hardly anybody, as a matter of fact, when I told Susie we were going to talk about the non-canonicals, she's like, really? who in the world talks about those things?
Well, it's true.
It is true,
yeah, because some people may
yeah.
not be aware that the New Testament Gospels aren't the only ancient religious writings that talk about Jesus. And I wanted to talk about it with you today because as the world becomes kind of more consolidated, as more information gets sent out into the world via the internet and social media, and there's so much false information out there, I think people are becoming more and more aware of these non-canonical Gospels. In fact, I read that when you were investigating Christianity as an atheist, you were actually kind of fascinated by these non-canonical stories and legends about Jesus. So with all of these different writings, and we're going to get into the specifics of what some of those are in a minute, but with all these different writings, is it even possible to separate legend from history? And how do scholars do that? How do they determine the historical reliability of an ancient document? And then there's a special kind of twist that you have on it as a detective as well, and how you did that as you were going through some of these writings.
Yeah, so my own experience was that I didn't have any access. I mean, I was never raised in a Christian environment, so when I first started examining Christianity, I was just collecting data, and I wanted to know I knew what there are four. Forget about historians for a second, because I'm sure they have their own process. That's great. In a sense, detectives are also historians of a sort. If the crime occurred 3 weeks ago, or if it was just reported yesterday, I'm not testing something I can repeat the test. I'm looking at something forensically that's happened in the past, if it's 24 hours ago, or if in my cases, sometimes they're 30, 35 years ago, we're looking at something from history and trying to determine what is true. And I know one thing for sure, you cannot be considered a reliable eyewitness to anything unless you have four factors of witness reliability in place, and they're simple. One, were you there at all? Can you demonstrate that you were there? I mean, if you're not there and you just came into the thing 10 years later and want to try to convince me that you were there and saw something, if I can prove that you weren't even physically present, this whole thing's going to collapse. So were you actually physically present to see what you said you saw? Number two, can you be corroborated in some way? The more corroboration, the better, of course, but I would need some kind of corroboration or verification. Three, have you been changing your story, or have you been honest and accurate in the past and you're honest and accurate with this? You haven't been changing your story over the last 20 years. And four, do you have a reason to lie? Are you motivated to lie to me because there's something you can gain from the lie? Is there a bias that is driving you? So that's the four areas we look at, right? And so that's how I think we would test, rather. And I was somebody who didn't know what was what. I was new to Christianity. I knew there were these Gospels. And one day I was in a bookstore back when there actually were bookstores, and I was looking on the shelves in this Christian section just to see what I could find, what's been written about Christianity, blah, blah, blah. And I see this book called The Lost Books of the Bible. And not knowing what was even out there yet, because I was brand new to all this, I thought, what? There are some books that were lost? And so I bought this book, and that started me into a search for about a year or so, reading through all the non-canonicals, and of course this title for the book is the title you would want to give it if you wanted to sell books. But
Right.
this is not really describing the lost books of the Bible. It is describing the very well-known books that were discarded by those who knew better books of the Bible. But that's not a good title, right? So they are called the lost books of the Bible, and what they're describing are late, false, discarded legends of Christianity. People often say, well, if Jesus really lived, do you mean to tell me that all that ends up showing up in historical records are the four Christian Gospels? No, actually, that's not true. There are tons of other documents that show up like a ripple effect from the point of impact of Jesus on planet Earth. But the problem is that every ripple that gets further away from the point of impact is less powerful in terms of its truth value. And so by the time you get into the second century, whatever's being written about, you can trust there'll be some distortion. Then in the third century, even more. In the fourth century, even more. So what we're looking for are those documents that are early enough to have actually to pass the first requirement, to have really have been written by people who could have actually known Jesus, and written early enough that even if they weren't somebody who knew Jesus, the people who knew Jesus were still alive and could vet them and say, this is a lie. So the first criteria I'm always looking for is, were you really there? And if that's all we did is ask that single question, well, guess what you're going to limit yourself to? You're going to limit yourself to the four canonical Gospels, because everything else is late in history. Now, some are later than others, but they're late. And as a matter of fact, and people don't even realize that there's a whole set. And I'm just now starting to repopulate the Cold Case Christianity website with some of these. I had a website for years when I was a youth pastor called Please Convince Me. It doesn't contain all the articles it used to contain because we shifted everything over to the Cold Case Christianity website. But I didn't bring over all of the non-canonicals. I had an article written for every significant non-canonical that's out there. And I've only brought a few of those over. So as I was getting ready to talk to you about this, I realized I should probably republish all of the other articles, and I will over the next several months start to republish all those. But I've written on all of them because I was so fascinated by them. I'm thinking I probably have, let's see, just looking at this right now, 37 that I've written something on.
Because you even so, though, you do have quite a bit of blog posts and articles written about it, even on your coldcasechristianity.com website now.
There are a few, definitely. And so the things that I thought were the most pressing, of course, is if you knew that there was another gospel out there that was written by somebody who had written a gospel in your Bible. So in other words, if you knew that there was a secret gospel of Mark, wow, wouldn't you want to know what's in it? If you knew that there was an apocryphon of John, or if you knew that there was an infancy gospel of pseudo-Matthew, wouldn't you want to know? I mean, these are the same people who wrote our gospel authors, our canonical gospels, right? So wouldn't you want to know what else they had to say? Well, of course, this isn't what else they had to say. These are late forgeries that, of course, borrowed the names of people they thought they could, make themselves look important,
right?
And they put those names on the gospel text. But there are many reasons to discount or to discredit. They're discredited for a number of reasons, and there's no reason why. There's actually a good reason why they're not included in the canon.
Yeah,
because they couldn't pass the four tests that we're talking about for reliable eyewitness testimony.
And some of these, I've read some of these non-canonical gospels and writings, and it seems like they modify the story of Jesus, even the character of Jesus and who he is as a person. What do you think motivated the early non-canonical writers to do that, to modify the story of Jesus?
Yeah, so as you read through them all, you see certain trends appear. One of the most simple ones, which can kind of seem rather benign, at least on its face, is that sometimes people just wanted to provide information that they thought was missing from the canonicals. You see that what's written about Jesus seems to be rather limited. What did Jesus do from the baptism, from his infancy blessing, let's say, to the age of 12, where he first appears in the temple? That's a big gap. We don't have any information about Jesus. What does he do from the time he's 12 to the time he's 30? Before you start to see him come, be baptized by John and all of this. That's a big gap. So some of these are just, they want to operate in the gaps. So they write about stories that fill in the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, they've also got other motives that lead them to say things about those gaps that aren't true. Now, sometimes it's just that they're from some heretical group, where they just held a belief that was not supported by Scripture. So they began to write a set of documents that either fills in the gaps and supports their heresy, or rewrites or adds something to the story of Jesus. After he ascended into heaven, he came back and he spoke to John, and he gave John secret teaching. As a matter of fact, that's another reason why some of these are written, because a lot of the Gnostic kind of Gospels claim to have secret teaching, and you couldn't be part of this elite group unless you knew the secrets, the secret information, this esoteric secret that's hidden. So some of these Gospels provide these esoteric secrets that gave their own groups power. Because if you weren't part of that group, you didn't know the truth, because there was something secret that needed to be known. Some of these have a theological bend, where maybe they don't support, this early belief that if something was physical, it was evil. You had to be entirely non-physical, non-material to be of the spiritual realm. Some early groups would try to make Jesus out to be something other than a material man. So some of these have been rewritten because, again, they're trying to push a theoretical or a philosophical, theological position. And so they're twisting the truth to do that. So as you read through all of them, you do get a sense of these motives appearing again and again and again. But honestly, if you didn't know what their motive was, and that comes down to bias, what is their bias? Why would they lie? Mm-hmm. So they don't pass the test that way. But for me, I always say, look, before you can be considered a legitimate eyewitness account, it has to have been written by somebody who lived early enough to have been an eyewitness. So I think what happens in most of these is they're disqualified before you even begin to examine the other factors, because they are too late in history. So if I can put someone's name on it, like say for the Apocryphon of John, okay, well that the earliest potential dating for that document is about 120, 125, but probably closer to 180. So it's way too late to have been written by anybody who would have personally known Jesus. Mm-hmm. The infancy gospel of Pseudo Matthew is an 8th century document. Okay, now you're 800 years too late. I mean, so these are the kinds of things that you have to look at first. And by the way, for the most part, early church leaders knew they were late and called them out as late. So it's not as though these are like, oh, we're just making this decision now in the 21st century. No, the people who are actually leading the church at the time saw the appearance of many of these late gospels and said, hey, guys, time out. There may be some truth in there. And by the way, that's the other thing I wanted to tell you is that if you work with liars, you learn how liars work. And typically, if you've ever played that game, I'm going to tell you 4 things. 3 things are true and 1 thing's a lie. There's a little game we sometimes play with each other. And we'll tell 3 truths and 1 lie. Well, the best lies are the lies where if you write them out on paper, 90% of the words actually describe something true. But they've changed 1 detail. So the 10% of the words are describing something untrue. And why that's hard to, because then in my mind's eye, I can say, yeah, last night I got home and a raccoon came in the house and knocked over the dog food and tore a hole in the dog food bag and ate out the dog food. I had dog food all over my den. As a matter of fact, there were 4 pieces of dog food in the water dish, which is weird, right? I mean, why would they get in the water dish? Okay, now that's a lie, but tell me what part is the lie. Well, it turns out the only part that's a lie is that it wasn't your raccoon, it was a cat. Your cat came in and did it. But now everything else I tell about the story, I can tell in great detail, even the 2 pieces of dog food in the water dish, because that really was there. It's just that the raccoon was not the culprit, the cat was. So it turns out that's a big difference in the story, but 90% of it is true. Good liars retain the 90% that's true, but they change the 1 significant detail, and their storytelling sounds true because they include details that aren't. Well, that happens in the Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels as well. Sometimes, some are better than others, but some will tell a certain percentage of things that are true to get you to buy the stuff that's not true. So it's about look. So don't be surprised if you open up a Gnostic gospel and you look at it and you go, "Wow, some of it looks pretty decent."
Yeah.
But then you find out that I'll give you an example of this. There's a gospel that's late in history. I think it's the preaching of Peter. Some of these early gospels will say something true, and even early bishops will say, "Well, yeah, it's mostly true, but you should not use it because it's not accurate." But they'll say it's mostly true
Yeah.
because that's what good lies are, is mostly true.
Right.
So I think it's a matter of us putting that four-part template. Is it early enough? Can it be corroborated? Has it been honest and accurate over time? And finally, is there a reason why this group would lie that is motivating such a lie? And if you put that template in place, you'll see that all of these fail.
Yeah, and you mentioned Gnosticism and Gnostic Gospels. And for listeners that may not be familiar with those terms, Gnosticism was an early heresy that began to kind of spring up in the church. And many of our church fathers spent quite a bit of ink refuting these heresies. And so, Gnosticism might be a massive motivator with a lot of these Gospels to push their ideas onto Jesus and so forth.
Yeah, and especially a lot of these ideas, that Jesus was the most credible, very credible leader in this time, especially religious leader, icon of religious leadership. So if you could attach whatever your little sect, whatever your sect beliefs are, if you can say these came from the lips of Jesus, or the lips of Jesus through one of his disciples, you could gain great credibility for your errant beliefs. And that was not unusual in the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christendom. And so what happens is because the story gets morphed, you'll have some people, for example, like Bart Ehrman, who will say, hey, there are so many early Christianities, in other words, early forms of Christianity, that you can't trust that any of them are true. And I would say, well, no, that's not true. I can have 20 people who will claim to be an eyewitness to my crime, and they'll pop up because they're relatives of the defendant. I get it. In the end, the only ones that are going to count are the ones I can demonstrate were actually there to see this and don't have a horse in the race. They would report it fairly. And when you do that, there aren't a lot of Christianities to choose from. There are just the canonical Gospels to choose from because everything is late with a bias that causes it to lie. So I don't think that that's fair to say. It's not as though all of these ideas about Jesus were held on the same playing field. They didn't have equal status in terms of their truth value.
Yeah.
And we just happen to pick the one that wins. No, it's not that at all. It's that the earliest version of Christianity still survives. And every later distortion of Christianity eventually withers. And that's what's happening here.
Yeah, and a great book on that subject is The Heresy of Orthodoxy by Michael Kruger. Have you read that one?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's a great book.
That's a great book if you want to know more about just what Jim was just talking about. So let's walk through some of these more specific Gospels. And I want to start by asking you, I don't even need to tell you which one it is. You'll know which one it is when I tell you this story. But this is a true story. This happened to someone that I know. And they called me, this friend called me and said, I got to ask you about what I just heard in my small group at this church. And I need you to help me with this. So my friend was sort of looking for a home church and had been attending this one church for a while, just run-of-the-mill, non-denominational church. And so she decided to try a small group. And so she goes to the small group, and the guy that was leading the small group said to the group, hey, you all know Jesus was married, right? And I know. And my friend was like, in her mind going, no, I know that's not true. And so the guy basically began to tell them about this scroll, is what he said, that was found. And he said, you all know that the Bible's not the only scroll, right? And so what was interesting to me is my friend called me after and was like, can you help me with this? Obviously, I know that's not true what he was saying, but how do I answer this? And the interesting thing she pointed out was that in the group, nobody said one thing to this guy. She says, I didn't say anything. Nobody else said anything. We just moved on and went on to something else. And it was really troubling to her that she didn't know how to answer him. And so actually I referred her to your website because you've done so much great work on this. But, with that story told, what advice would you give her, or what would you have done if you were in that group?
Well, first of all, I would have said, well, does it pass the test? because there's a test. It's the 4-point
Yeah.
test we've already talked about. Is it early? Can it be corroborated? Has it changed over time? And is there some reason why a group might even say this early, but be motivated to lie about it? Now, as it turns out, as you know now, we've done a lot of testing on this little fragment. You know, you're right. It's a fragment of papyrus. It's got a Coptic text on it, and the words that seem to be the ones that are the most radioactive are this line that says, Jesus said to them, quote, my wife, ... and the rest of the text is cut off because it's only a fragment. And it was first, I think, around 2012 or so is when it first kind of came out and made a big buzz. Now, since that time, they've done some carbon dating on this. Also, they've done some other kind of testing in terms of how it's written, the kind of ink on the papyrus. They now think it's a forgery, or at least a lot of people think that the best evidence here is actually a forgery. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say it's not a forgery. Then the question becomes, first question, how early is it? Is it early enough to actually be written at a time when it could be cross-checked by others? And it's not early enough. It's, if they're thinking right now, even if it was an accurate piece of data, that it's a 4th century piece of data, it's way too late. So even from the very beginning, look, people can have all kinds of ideas. If you're a group that wants to argue for a certain kind of marriage or for a certain kind of sexual activity, and you want to argue that Jesus was married. I mean, this is not the only crazy thing about Jesus that was written in the 4th century. I mean, there's a ton of other crazy things written about Jesus that are even crazier than him having a wife. All those things are not true either. These are the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th rings of dropping that coin in the water, the ripples. These are the 5th and 6th and 7th ripples of the Jesus story. By the way, you would expect if God truly came to earth, that there would be a huge ripple effect in time and in literature related to the person of Jesus. And sure enough, there is. So why are we getting so surprised about it? Of course, if there's a Paul Bunyan, or how shall I say this? If there's an Abe Lincoln, there will be legends of Abe Lincoln that emerge. I just saw a movie in which Abe Lincoln was a zombie, right? And he's coming back from the dead. So we're going to twist the story. Now, look, if you said, well, I don't know if Abe Lincoln was president of the United States. It's just about 100 years later that I saw there was a movie in which he was a zombie killer. And I'm thinking, okay, does that make it that a legitimate part of the story? It's 100 years late and it's fiction. So here what we have is, even if this was a legitimate papyrus from the 4th century, it's too late, and that's the problem. There's lots of groups that come up with all kinds of weird theological positions that write all kinds of versions of Jesus. And so the fact that there's a version, if you hear a story about me, I would hope you would not assume it's true, especially if it's somebody who's never met me, who's telling it to you. So here we have somebody who's never met Jesus, who's writing about Jesus. And the earliest writings we have from those who actually met Jesus don't speak of Jesus this way. So I would, if I had a choice of which version to believe, I would always believe the one I thought came from a reliable eyewitness.
Yeah, and one thing that's always been interesting to me about these non-canonical gospels too is just from a textual angle. It's like for the gospels, the New Testament Gospels, there's close to 6,000 manuscripts in Greek and like 19 or 20,000 in other languages. There's so much evidence to back up what they're saying. And often with these non-canonicals, like in the case of the one we've just been talking about, the Gospel of Jesus' wife, as it's called, you're talking about, in that case, isn't that just one fragment?
Right.
There's nothing else.
What always fascinates me about these kinds of stories is that it could be presented at some press release, and the next day it's going to be printed on the media as though this is the one life-changing truth about you. So it's got no other document like it exists. We've got one fragment of one copy from the 4th century. Really? I mean, I'm surprised this made any buzz at all, given what it actually is. But you're right. I know from having been approached by networks to do shows on Jesus. About every Easter, I get approached to do a show. And what I'm typically approached is if I had an angle that debunked the Jesus story, or that attempted to debunk the Jesus story, I know I could make a show tomorrow. But so far, My story would be that I've looked at the evidence and the story is true, and nobody wants that as a show.
Right.
So what you see here is we got a story that attempts to put the Jesus story on its ear, and that's what's going to make the headlines. If this was a story that came out and confirmed the Jesus story in some way, like a lot of archaeology has in the last year, those stories don't hardly ever make the press the way these do.
Yeah. And one of the most popular ones, and the one that kind of gets trotted out, at least in my experience, the most, is one that's called the Gospel of Thomas. Tell us about the Gospel of Thomas. Why was it rejected by the church? And is there anything we can actually learn about Jesus in spite of maybe its unreliability?
Well, and that's one of the kind of the cool things about all of these Gnostic Gospels. When you tell a lie that is grounded in something true, you have to kind of inadvertently tell something true. So there is, because most good lies incorporate something true, we could actually look at some of these lies and ask ourselves the question, okay, is there something, what is that? In other words, if you're going to make a statement about Jesus that is false, you have to first admit that it was a Jesus.
Right.
If you're going to tell a lie about Jesus, that confirms at least one thing. There must have been a guy named Jesus about whom you could lie. So here what you have is this Gospel of Thomas. It's first discovered right around like 1945. There's a collection of papyrus that were discovered in Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And this came out of this collection. And what it is a collection of sayings that is allegedly attributed to Jesus. Again, they're written in Coptic. And because we don't think, remember that kind of demonstrates a layer of historical separation from truth when you see that it's not in a language that is part of the original authorship. So if in the region we're going to be writing either in Hebrew, or we're going to be writing in Greek, or we're going to be writing in Aramaic, but now we see a language that's none of those. It means it has to be someplace outside the region, at least. That always gives me pause for concern on its own. But
Right.
but what happens here is that the text claims to be authored by Thomas, right? But most scholars will reject that. Why? Again, it's too late in history. The oldest manuscript fragments we have are from about 135 or so to 250. And most people who, because of that, they say, well, there's nothing earlier than the 2nd century. Most scholars don't think there is anything earlier than mid-2nd century. And there are also a ton of passages here that just appear to be harmonizations of the verses from the canonical gospel. So instead of being a legitimate statement, they seem to be like somebody has just taken several verses of the gospels and harmonized them and put them on the lips of Jesus as a kind of a summary. Now, that means that more than likely all the canonical gospels are written and well known prior to the writing of this text. So another good reason to believe this text is late. It's borrowing from the language of Luke rather than Mark, which is also interesting, I think, because if that's the case, the text has got to follow Luke. And most people would say Luke is borrowing from Mark, which it is. I believe it is also. I think that Luke knew Mark and is quoting Mark often. So, I mean, there's actually people out there, and I think these are good scholars, who believe that this Gospel of Thomas is actually written with heavy reliance on a document called the Diatessaron, which Tatian wrote around 172, 75, right in that range. And they do this based on some of the colloquial language that's in both of these documents. Here's my point. Even Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, thinks that the Gospel of Thomas is a 2nd century Gnostic text, and he bases that on the fact that it doesn't have any references to the coming kingdom of God, to the return of Jesus. A lot of the things that he would say are similar in other Gnostic sects. The point is, even a skeptic like him says this is not something that is early enough to have been written by anyone who would really have. Thomas could not have written this because it's too late in history. As a matter of fact, Hippolytus, who is the student of Irenaeus, right? Hippolytus is right around 220. He writes a series of refutations to heresies from 222 to 235. He calls it out as a fake. Origen called it out as a fake when he was writing around 233. Eusebius called it out as a fake when he was writing the church history in 326. Cyril told his followers that it was a fake when he was writing in 347, 343. So 348 rather. So I think you've got lots of good reason to reject this as legitimately coming from Thomas. But here's what's cool about it. Even though there's lots of good reason not to believe it came from Thomas, There are some things about Jesus it does confirm. If nothing else, it gives you a sense that Jesus must have been a real person in history. He must have been a teacher, because now these false teachings of Jesus are out there, right? The teachings of Jesus are paramount in the Gospel of Thomas. Half of the sayings are simply repetitions and confirmations of the stuff we see in the canonical Gospels. Also, the Gospel of Thomas affirms that Jesus had a bunch of disciples. It mentions Peter, Matthew, Thomas, James by name. There are other biblical characters that are mentioned, like Mary and Salome. So these are just points of confirmation. So again, what it does for us is it's hard to lie about someone if that someone never existed. Like most good lies, there's a percentage of truth in here, and that's what happens here. Now, there are some problems with it as well. And I think those, but I forget about the problems. There's no reason to examine the differences between this and the reliable account once you know that this is not a reliable account. So why would you, so for example, there's no point in my dissecting the history of Abraham Lincoln based on the movie in which he's a zombie slayer. Right. Because we know that's not a true account that's reliable, so there's no point in trying to compare the two. So the same thing happens here. There's no point in comparing what Jesus is like in the Gospel of Thomas when virtually everyone from history and even modern skeptics like Bart Ehrman do not believe this is a reliable account written by somebody who knew Jesus named Thomas.
Isn't it amazing how much information gets spread around on social media by people who have just not even bothered to discover the facts about things? It's just stunning to me sometimes when I hear the reality of things and go, my goodness, I mean, there's blog posts with thousands of likes right now saying that the Gospel of Thomas is this legit version of the story of Jesus, Yeah,
well, it's interesting is that this is one of those that long before we discovered a copy of it, we knew that early church fathers were writing about it. So we knew there was, but that wasn't the only thing they were writing about. They were writing about a bunch of Gnostic trash, basically. And so the people who were kind of had been in the know have known that there's lots of stuff that was written about Jesus, much of which we can't find, that early church fathers were calling out to the attention of their followers and saying, hey, don't believe that stuff.
Yeah.
So now we happen to have it in our hands. So what? I mean, it's not like it was unknown. Like, oh my gosh, look what we found.
Right.
People have been talking about it for centuries, and now we just have a copy of it. We can see firsthand why they decided it wasn't true.
Yeah. And there are so many more. There's the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter. And if you want to learn more about these so-called lost Gospels or these non-canonical writings about Jesus, you can go to Jim's website, coldcasechristianity.com. He's got a bunch of articles on there even right now. I think you've got a couple of podcasts about this as well up on your site. Mm-hmm. And hopefully all these 37 or so articles that you had on the other site will make their way over. I'm fascinated by this stuff. So I want to thank you so much for coming on. And as we close, is there anything else you want to add? Anything that just comes to mind as we close out today?
I'm just glad to do it. I mean, this is one of those areas, right, that I thought it made me stumble early on as a new Christian who was surprised to find that there were lost books. But again, these weren't lost. They were well known at the time they appeared. They were well known and discredited early. So these are the early discredited, kind of kicked to the curb versions of Jesus that everyone knew was a lie when they first saw him. So that's a better way to title these. But I think in the end, it's important for us, if for no other reason, to be able to have in our mind that simple template, because that'll help you knock down the objection when you're in that Bible study like your friend and someone says this is true. You can ask the question, well, how early is that? Oh, it's 4th century? Why would you think it's true if it's in the 4th century? Lots of lies were told about Jesus in the first 400 years. Yeah. The only true things were the ones that were told by people who actually knew him. And you didn't know him if you're writing about him in the 4th century. So I think that kind of ends it, and then everyone can kind of move on. At least know what the principles are so you can knock down the objections.
Well, that's great advice. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on and talking with me today. It's always a pleasure.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast and would like to sign up to receive my blog posts and podcasts by email, you can go to alisachilders.com and click the subscribe button, or you can simply subscribe to the Alisa Childers podcast on iTunes.